G'day folks, my name is Rob. Welcome back to another F1 fantasy video. Today we're looking at my team selection for race week 16 ahead of the Singapore Grand Prix. As always, if you're new around here or you enjoy the content, please do like the video and subscribe to the channel. It goes a very long way for me and for the content on this channel moving forward. So as always, we're going to recap how I did in the most recent race and then look towards how my team is shaping up for the upcoming race. So 251 points all out at Monza, the Temple of Speed. There was a lot of talk around which builds were going to be most appropriate given how rapid some of the constructors were looking in free practice. And I chose not to use Limitless, which I think will be a bit of the theme of this discussion for this race week review. There was a lot of chatter on Twitter in the lead up to the race around Ferrari's pace. They have had very good straight line speed this entire season, and from the performances we saw Leclerc and Sainz put in on Friday and Saturday morning, there was a mad rush from a lot of strategist players in the game to get on top of that as soon as possible, as well as the fact that there are still only a handful of races left, and a lot of us have chips still up our sleeve to use. Many people thought it would be a great time to use it. Go in triple Ferrari, triple Red Bull, and fill out that 7th position with a Mercedes driver or a driver of their choosing. So anyway, I guess I chose not to go with it. I wouldn't say the decision I made was the wrong one, and I'll get to that in a second. But it looks like on face value at the moment, the Limitless users did win the weekend in Monza. Ferrari absolutely hauled. Sainz had driver of the day, equaled Max's total points, and then Leclerc also had a very solid performance too. So I think the team roughly came, a Limitless team of triple Ferrari, triple Red Bull, and say Lewis Hamilton came in around 333 points, about 80 odd points more than me. And we'll, as I said, get into that in a second, the breakdown of, I guess, the Limitless chip and whatnot, and how that affected ranks in a moment. But Max was my DRS boost, hasn't changed. I imagine for most of you watching this have very much the same setup on the DRS boost. So Max for me, double points. Checo, 30 points, a podium as well. Had a pretty solid fantasy weekend if we just go into his stats. A market improvement from some of the drives we've seen in qualifying from him lately, and managed to come out second place with a couple of overtakes to boot. So solid performance from him. I guess made a case in a number of my videos last week that the straight line speed of that Red Bull was too hard for me to move off Checo, but I guess a lot of people that didn't feel so encouraged by some of his recent qualifying performances went elsewhere, and Sainz was a very popular vote as a result of what we saw on the Friday. Fernando unfortunately wasn't able to replicate much of the performance he had in the previous week. 5 points, not by any means an encouraging drive or fantasy production from him. I definitely thought there'd be a little bit more from Aston Martin. We saw those upgrades work quite nicely in the last 2 races since the mid-season break. Not to be, unfortunately, just squeezed into Q3 on Saturday and didn't really kind of feature much at all in a lot of the battles for points. So a pretty quiet weekend for Fernando across the board, hoping he's able to rebound a little bit in Singapore. The rest of the team, Joe, 3 points. I mean, I can't really get too upset with a budget driver, but I was deliberating between him, Logan Sargent, and Yuki Tsunoda. I guess out of those 3, I feel like I made the right decision. Tsunoda with the DNF, and he was one I was very much considering at that same price point. So very fortunate there. And then Albon, just Mr. Consistent at the moment, churning out double-digit performances week in, week out. And nothing, again, incredible, but for a driver in a car that's probably 7th or 8th on the grid right now, to be able to continually get those points finishes, make up a couple of positions or overtakes over the last few races, pretty good production from someone at his price. As far as Red Bull and McLaren are concerned, both, again, not really going anywhere in my team. I think McLaren are very much value for money, and I will point out, though, that this score is slightly inflated by the fact that they had both the fastest pit stop and the fastest lap attributed to that total. So probably not quite as handsome a total for them had it not been for those 2 factors. But notwithstanding that, I think for me, it'll either be Aston Martin or McLaren at that second constructor position. So for now, I'm pretty comfortable with where I'm at for McLaren. So I did want to take a look at the Limitless one more time just before we move into the next part of this video. A lot of people were very successful with using it. Awesome work to all of you guys that were took the punt on it. I was very reluctant, and despite the fact that Ferrari had some shortcomings in previous races, they were able to pull together a weekend at Monza, which probably hasn't been reflective of some of the performances in the past they would have hoped for. So if we go over to F1fantasytools.com, we'll take a look at the optimal teams for this race week just gone. There's a budget in here of 123, but obviously if you're on Limitless, we can just assume that max budget in this case is 200. So a lot of people did run the Red Bull Ferrari constructor combination, max at the 2 times Sainz, Perez, Leclerc, and Hamilton. 333 for a team of that build, and much the same with those if you flipped out Hamilton for Russell. You go a little bit further down the board for a few different variations of that build, but the top 1 or 2 were definitely the most consistent, and they beat out my team by, as I said before, 80 odd points. Now, I guess for me, the approach was always to use Limitless on a sprint race weekend because the point ceiling is so much higher. I'm still absolutely invested with doing that. And I suppose I wanted to look at a previous sprint race to get a flavour for whether or not, had I activated it at, say, Belgium, the most recent sprint race, what that would have scored me based on the performance of certain constructors at that point in time. So I said earlier that the Limitless outperformed a standard build by around 80 points in Monza. If we look at the sprint race in Spa, I didn't activate Limitless then, but had I done so, that would have got me approximately 379 points. So for instance, going back to the results of that weekend, I would have had Max at the 2 times. You can sum these up if you want to, if you don't believe me. So I would have had Max at the 2 times. I would have gone for double Mercedes, given they were the team looking strongest in practice that weekend. Would have also gone for double Red Bull, understand a triple Red Bull if I include the constructor there. Perez, the obvious outlier. And then most likely would have gone for Leclerc because versus him and Sainz, it's always going to be Leclerc for me if we're taking a premium asset on a Limitless. So that, as I said, would have scored me 379 points. And we go back to look at my team in Spa without any Limitless chips activated. I also took a -4 that week. I finished with 288. So that's, 91 points better off if my math is correct. And given that was on a sprint race weekend, had I done the same thing in Monza, I only would have been, say, 70, 80 odd points off. So it's very much, you can make a case both ways, but I always wanted to tackle the sprint race weekend with Limitless because of the fact that it just offers a little bit more in terms of points totals. So I'm most likely going to look into activating that at either Circuit of the Americas or at Qatar, only because the likelihood of wet weather at both of those circuits is much lower than somewhere like Interlagos, which is one of the last races on the calendar this year. So that's kind of my approach there, and I will release another chip usage video for the second half of the season before Singapore, because I do expect there will be a use case for another chip at the Singapore Grand Prix. So we're going to take a look at how my team's looking for Singapore now. This, as I said, was how it was for the most recent race. And there's probably not a lot I want to do here for now. As I mentioned, there's a case to be made for a certain chip at Singapore. I think that's no negative. The reason I say that is because Singapore is the last street circuit on the calendar, and there, at the time of recording, is forecast for rain. That I expect will no doubt change as we approach that race weekend in over a week's time now. So it could well be a dry race, but I think the fact that a street circuit creates its own problems, much narrower turns and straights. We've seen in the past at many other street circuits, there is a high rate of a DNF there for just about every driver across the board. So I think to mitigate that element of risk, potentially activating the no negative there could hopefully put my team in good stead. I think the irony of the no negative chip is that when you do activate it, you want all of your drivers to essentially DNF because that everyone else owns, or drivers that everyone else owns, you want them to DNF, if I can reword that a little better. Only because if they get hit with that -20 and you're on the no negative, that score that you have will be converted to 0. The score that everyone else gets would be a -20 or whatever negative score is attributed as a result of that. So a little, I guess, not exactly the most, it's a little counterproductive, to be honest, that chip. I'm not sure if I like it, but given that we have to use it before the season's end, I can't think of a much better time to at a street circuit. So I know Red Bull, obviously very reliable. They are most likely going to stay in my team unless there's anything in practice to suggest otherwise. Given I missed out on the Carlos Sainz price rise, that leaves me with a little less flexibility than I would have liked. I'm currently sitting at a 120.9. Let's just double check. I'll refresh the screen. And my budget's probably much lower than most people in the game. I've clearly just missed out on a couple of price rises here and there that have obviously made it not ideal when trying to build out my team and build up my budget. So 120.9 on the screen, you can see there. I have Alex Albon in this position here, Joe here, are probably the two that I'm most looking to rotate. Potentially Fernando Alonso as well. I think the circuit at Singapore, we've got a few more turns on this track. So I think that would most likely favour a car with a higher downforce setup, such as McLaren. Very grateful I had the constructor in the most recent race at Monza because they did quite well. I guess the obvious trade for me would be to get in Oscar Piastri. Now, I also rolled a trade from Monza into this week, so I could potentially go for 3 here. If I choose not to go with Joe, and I'm not convinced on Checo, even though he is the king of the street circuit, so maybe he could turn something in for Singapore. We never know. I am thinking about potentially Charles Leclerc. Now, I don't have the budget to stretch to someone like Hulk or Liam Lawson or Logan Sargent down here. I think that's certainly a viable build for a lot of people to consider. The alternate for me would be to go for someone like Carlos Sainz. He has, really matched Charles there lately in terms of fantasy production. So, and not even fantasy production on the racetrack too. We saw he was obviously across the weekend a stellar performer in practice and in qualifying. So I think he's certainly an option. That gives me 7.8 if I was to go for someone like Oscar. There isn't really much in the way of optionality between Alex Albon, who's nearly 9, and let's say Joe is the next viable budget option. I'm not including K-Mag just because he's not featured whatsoever on the fantasy radar this season. So if I go for Carlos, it doesn't give me much to move around. I could, however, if I decided to go without Fernando Alonso, it gives me 15.5. Now that I could sneak in Lando Norris here. I really like this build. The triple McLaren, I think all of those assets are still due for price rises. We've seen 0.5 from both drivers after pretty mediocre fantasy performances on the weekend. So I think that just gives them a little bit more space to rise. Carlos, he outperformed Checo last weekend fantasy-wise, and then Joe, I mean, that you could pivot to someone else if you don't like him, like Yuki Tsunoda. Keep in mind, Yuki didn't do particularly well at Singapore last year, so maybe just something to think about. But I really like this build. For me, it would require... Actually, no, it wouldn't require a hit at all. It would just be the 3 drivers, and that's it. So I think that's certainly a viable option. And given that I'm tripled up on another team other than tripled up on McLaren and doubled on Red Bull, I think if any of these drivers get hit with a DNF, that -20 in the constructor can hurt. You're pretty much double dipping on that -20. So I think if you're doubling or tripling up on teams heading into Singapore, no negatives, another justifiable reason to use it then. So anyway, that's kind of where my team's at for Singapore. At the time of recording, you can see there's almost 11 days until the race is due to be run, qualifying is due to be run. So lots of time to think about. I am going to be back with at least one, hopefully 2 more videos before the deadline. So do stay tuned and subscribe to the channel to make sure you're locked in with all of that. But I think for now, that is going to be where I leave it. Chip usage strategy video for the second half will be a certain video out before the deadline, as I said, and I'll try to be back with my final thoughts. But in the meantime, guys, if you don't hear from me again, good luck with your teams this weekend, and I'll see you all very soon.